We just got the number, nearly 3 million new claims for unemployment last week. And as we talk about the future of work and what that even looks like and the state of the economy and so much more, we're privileged to have Eric Schmidt join us, former CEO and executive chairman of Google. He's also the co-founder of Schmidt Futures. Eric, it's great to see you. We did just get these terrible numbers crossing the tape again this morning. And before we even get to some of the future of work issues that I know you're grappling with in the state of New York and elsewhere, I'm curious what your own timeline is in terms of how you're thinking about the economy returning.
Well, good morning, guys. The core problem here is we've got to solve both a health problem and an economic problem at the same time. And so far, the rate of infections across the nation are not declining in a substantial way. So the way to say that is the same number of deaths next week as last week, that sort of thing. And with the decrease in social distancing and the improvement in weather, it's not clear to me whether they equilibrate or not. I worry a lot that we won't see much of a gain over the summer, and I worry a lot about a reinfection rate in the fall as people are inside and the flu season begins.
Therefore, are you? I mean, that's a relatively pessimistic view. Are you thinking that we're going to have therapeutics and potentially a vaccine on the other side in 2021? Are you thinking that we're all going to be wearing masks for a very long time?
I think we're going to be wearing masks and bowing as you do in Tokyo for a very long time. The core problem is that the country has not eliminated the virus and the globe has not eliminated the virus. And indeed, it's accelerating in places like Latin America and Russia, and maybe accelerating in places like India and Pakistan at a horrendous rate in the next 6 months. So I think a real look at the numbers says that the current optimism, which we all want to have, may not be justified. The fact of the matter is that we're not treating this as an information problem. The core issue you have is that you don't know whether you're going to get the disease or not. You need some way of knowing whether people have the disease or whether you're likely to get it, and the government needs ways to identify the hotspots. The majority of the transmission appears to be from super spreader people and super spreader events, and the ability to build systems that can identify those and then go and deal with them deal with both community spread, but also interventions like contact tracing and so forth, is the only way we're going to really lower the numbers. And you heard this in the testimony in the Senate 2 days ago.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the future work and maybe some of the work you're doing with the Governor Cuomo in the state of New York. New York City represents a majority of the tax base and revenue to the city. Frankly, is a huge contributor to the rest of the country and to the tri-state area. And it is relying in large part, the city this is, on public transportation. And I know you've talked about offices being spread out and work changing. But if work really does change, can you be bullish on the state of New York? Can you be bullish on the city of New York over the long term? Or is it fundamentally going to change forever?
I am very bullish on New York State and New York City in the long term. And the governor is doing a really good job of addressing this. He's got the data out and he's actually putting these teams together. I'm fortunate to do one of them. The way to think about the next year is we've got to, in 10 years, we've accelerated everything up to 1 year. So all those digital changes that we've talked about for years all happened last month and the month and the next month. So as an example, we're going to focus on telehealth, essentially broadband and access to broadband, and how and where we work. Those are at least our first initial 3 ones. Now, telehealth, well, the 80% of the people are going to the doctor electronically because they don't want to go to the doctor's office in case they get exposed. Well, that's a net improvement in efficiency for everyone. It's so much more convenient to see the doctor virtually than to have to go to their office and wait forever, right? That seems obvious. Your previous guest talked about the scale of broadband and how many people are using it and how people are getting used to it. Those changes are not going to go away. And then we are going to change the way we work. An example is that we're going to have less density in these buildings, at least until there's a vaccine, which is probably a 1.5 years, 2 years kind of time frame. And less density means literally more office space, not less. It also means a different architecture. Because of this transportation problem, some people are not going to want to go into the center of the super cities. They're going to actually want to go to hubs. So you think of it as a hub and spoke system. So when you reimagine all three together, you get a pretty good city and you get a pretty impressive state. And don't bet against America. Don't bet against New York State. We are innovators. We can solve this problem.
Would you, though, bet against super cities as you describe them over the long term? Meaning, do you think that this, I know so many people who grew up in the city, I grew up in the city, who are now talking about, and not just for the next year or two, they're saying, okay, maybe I should move to the suburbs, or maybe I should move even farther out, because, by the way, if you move to the suburbs, a lot of people take public transportation to get back into the city. But if I'm not going to be going to the city and I can't participate in the active life of the city in that way, that the value proposition changes.
Well, I would argue differently. I think that the city will reemerge even stronger, but it will be somewhat different. There's lots of evidence that the super cities, of which New York is maybe the archetype in the world, economically, in terms of creativity, people are social. They do need to be physically next to each other or near each other, but we will stop pressing the elevator buttons. We will stop holding onto the banisters quite as much. Some of the interactions will change, and those are probably permanent. But from my perspective, we're not all going to move to the suburbs. The cities will stay there and, in fact, emerge in a different way. I do think we're going to have to make some changes. So, for example, the buildings in New York, you want to sort of increase the air handling. You want to put in UV filters for the air, those sorts of things. Frankly, for things like the subway, people are going to be wearing masks, right? As dirty as the subway cars are, the disease is not from the subway car, it's from people transmission. The vast majority of the transmission is person to person.
One of the things we've been talking about all morning, and we talked with Tom Friedman about, is schools, though, and how you get schools back up and running. There's such a critical component to the economy because if parents are stuck at home trying to help their kids do school over Zoom or virtual school, it means they're not at work. How do we confront that challenge? Especially when when some of the data suggests that kids are not having problems, and then there are these anecdotal, terrible stories, and I think it's really raised questions for parents.
There's lots of evidence that the kids can transmit it. They can actually get infected. They just don't show the symptoms. So kids are not immune to this disease. No one is, right? Everyone is eligible for this dead virus, if you think of it that way. So if you look in Europe, schools are beginning to reopen with various adjustments, more sort of physical constraints. They're doing dual shifts and so forth. It will be incredibly important for all the schools in America, and in particular those in New York City, to open up by September. I just don't think we can get the economic productivity that we need if we're forcing everybody to stay home and to educate their kids because we can't get the teachers and the kids together. That problem and the transportation problems have to be solved. Remember, with de-densification, you can solve a lot of these problems. The tools in 1918 that we had in the last big pandemic were social distancing, wash your hands a lot, and wear masks. And they had all these ditties and so forth about it, which were very interesting. So we have the same tools we had 100 years ago. Now, there's much research. I funded quite a bit of it myself in accelerating both vaccines as well as antivirals and treatments and so forth. We also understand much, much more about this disease than in record time in biology. It's a huge, huge boon to that. But the fact of the matter is those are the tools you have. So when you think about how you behave, what can you do? Wear a mask. I'm shocked that the government doesn't require these things. I mean, it seems obvious because it's a help. The mask helps me not spread it to you. Washing hands, social distancing, and being outside.
Right. What do you make of what's going to be a battle, I imagine, across the country as businesses restart and ask their employees to come back to work? You're already seeing this battle, if you will, play out to some degree with Elon Musk and Tesla in California, where as an incentive or an inducement, some people might describe as bullying, they're telling some of those employees, if you don't come to work, whether you feel comfortable or not, you won't be able to get unemployment insurance. So how do you think that that's going to play over time? Because there's going to be a lot of businesses that are going to be asking people to come to work, some of whom are going to be desperate to come back to work, some of whom are going to say, for whatever reason, I don't want to.
It's never a good idea to force your employees under fear of losing their jobs to come to work. It doesn't produce the right outcome. The reality is that corporations broadly are going to find themselves in roughly three categories. People who are literally cannot go to work because they have kids and so forth and so on. People who don't want to go to work, or they are worried about exposure because they have comorbidities and so forth, and people who are just dying to go to work, right? They just can't wait to get out of the house. So my guess is that you're going to see pods of people which will organize themselves so that this group will be over in this remote place. This group will be in the central office. These people will never come into either because they have legitimate fears until this thing gets resolved, which is a long time. And that these little teams will organize in virtual pods and they'll work it out. So employers will have to give employees some kind of flexibility. If the answer is that the employers are going to be forced to come to work in order to do their job at a genuine fear of infection and significant health problems, it's going to be a tough time.
What do you make of the way you think the world of technology is going to be viewed when this is all over? You know, going into this pandemic, there was what was called the techlash, the backlash against technology. And now it's so clear that we are as reliant as ever on Amazon and Google and so many other technology companies. Some of that may play in their favor, but you're also seeing lots of criticism and critique still of Amazon, for example.
Well, any big company is going to be criticized. And the fact of the matter is, try to imagine your experience in this pandemic right now without these tech companies. So let's give them a little bit of credit. Most of them are relatively inexpensive. People are now relying on them in a way. It used to be that the internet was optional, right? That you could sort of live with it or live without it. Now you really need it to get through the day. You need it for food. You need it for information. You need it for employment. One of the goals that we have is to make sure that everybody has access to that. So, for example, if you look at overall in New York State, there's a real disparity of access to these things. You can't participate in the economy without a digital connection now. It used to be that you could. And by the way, one of the things that the government should be doing as they think about how to deal with stimulus is they need to be doing a significant infrastructure bill. And that infrastructure bill needs to include access to technology of one kind or another and communications around the country. This remains a problem, especially in rural areas, and it really is a disadvantage. As a country, we want equal opportunity for everybody. And the fact of the matter is that you need a broadband connection in order to participate. Think about kids that are being schooled from home, where the home has no access to cellular and no access to broadband. Literally, the parents are sitting there reading textbooks, right, which maybe they cannot even afford. It's really a problem. We need to address that, and we need to address that quickly.
Eric, geopolitical question. In one of your roles at Google, you spent a lot of time traveling the world, dealing with countries like China and making some very difficult decisions in the process. When you look at what's taking place now, the posture that our administration is taking towards China, what do you think the appropriate end goal or end result should be, given what's happening here?
So you would think that when we had one common enemy around the world, one common enemy, literally this virus that's killing millions of people all around the world, we would unite, but instead we have decoupled. And the cost of the decoupling is quite high. Now, some of the decoupling will make sense. We're going to have more resilient supply chains. We're going to have more manufacturing in the United States. That's all good. But the tensions are not good. All of these countries have huge militaries. They have all sorts of ways where they play to their domestic politics and they can do negative things. I think it's really important that we understand that as you decouple from China, and they are perfectly capable of building their own chips and their own software, they're not coming back. And that hurts us. We are stronger globally when we have a common information platform, when we communicate with each other. The net of this is we need more communication, not less positioning against, more, and figure out ways to collaborate. We're never going to be great friends, but we can collaborate on common problems, such as the pandemic.
But how do we do that if we don't trust them?
Well, you can in business, you have all sorts of examples of people who've been able to work together without trusting the other company. Why can't we do that at a nation state level? All you have to do is basically have diplomats who can sit there and argue through this stuff. It is in America's interest that American platforms, in particular all the computer platforms and networking platforms, spread globally. It makes no sense to block that. It makes everything. So the way I think of it is when we compete, we want to win. I strongly believe that American technology can win against all of the other challengers around the world because we're so good at this. So we need to get on a footing where we try to get these countries, including China, to use our platforms, not the opposite.